Welcome to the Truth in the Public Square podcast, a podcast dedicated to equipping Christians to engage culture and politics for the glory of God and the common good. I'm your host, Harrison Lang, and on today's podcast, I am joined by Dan Darling to discuss his recent book, In Defense of Christian Patriotism. Dan Darling is an author, pastor, and a thought leader. He currently serves as the director of the Land Center for Cultural Engagement at Southwestern Baptist Theological Seminary and assistant professor of faith and culture at Texas Baptist College in Fort Worth, Texas. Dan, thank you so much for joining us on the podcast.
Well, thank you for having me, Harrison, and so excited to be here, and I love what you're working on here with this project, and so just delighted to be with you today.
Well, thank you so much for the encouragement. As we start off this episode, I would love to hear an update on your life and ministry, any forthcoming writing projects you're working on, and just current state of affairs with the Darling family.
Yeah, so things are going well here. I'm, of course, lead the Center for Cultural Engagement here at Southwestern. I'm teaching in the college, in our faith and culture concentration, things like intro to ethics and apologetics, and working on a number of writing projects. You know, my book on patriotism came out, which I think we're going to talk about in the fall, and then I have a book coming out this year with B&H on it's called I think it's called Biblical Wisdom for Everyday Life, just answering questions on things that people have choices making, like, you know, gambling and cohabitation, marijuana, smokes is right for a Christian, all those kinds of things, like answering some of those harder ethical questions, or those ethical questions that pastors are facing. And then I'm working on a few other projects as well. Contributing to there's a new volume on Baptist social ethics that I wrote a chapter for as well. So yeah, always got stuff in front of me.
Yeah, is Andrew Walker part of that Baptist ethics? Yeah.
He contributed a chapter too. I wrote a chapter on co-belligerence. You know, when do you work with other groups like Catholics and others for cultural issues and those kinds of things.
Yeah, I saw Dr. Walker post about that, and I'm really looking forward to get my hands on it when it comes out.
And
it's
going to be great.
So speaking about your books, we are going to be talking about this book, In Defense of Christian Patriotism, which I do highly recommend. I do think that's very helpful. I would be curious what led you to write a book on Christian patriotism, what led to ultimately writing this book?
Well, first of all, I've always loved America. I've always felt deeply patriotic. My grandfather was a World War II veteran. In fact, I have his flag right here that he gave me that I received when he passed away. Full military honors. He served in World War II. But, you know, my family took a trip when I was like 10 or 11 to Washington, D.C. We packed up our station wagon in Chicago area, and we drove to Washington, D.C. My mom somehow planned a trip before the internet. I don't know how that was possible, but and I was just in awe of, you know, we visited the monuments, we visited the White House. You know, that was when you could do tours. This was like in the 80s, before there was a ton of as much security as there is now. We went to the Capitol, but I remember standing at the Lincoln Memorial and just being in awe of just, you know, this country and our values and the things that the ideals of this country. And so that was a primary motivation. Also, you know, we're celebrating our 250th anniversary this year, and it's a good time to reflect on what it means to be an American, patriotism. I also wrote it in response to, I think, a lot of Christians, well-meaning, Bible-believing Christians, have been made to feel guilty about loving their country. There's been a lot of books written in the last decade or so that really paint conservative Christians who love their country, want to get involved in public policy, as dangerous, as idolatrous, that they're putting country over God and all these kinds of things. And I wanted to give Christians a framework for what does it look like to be a citizen of the kingdom of God and a citizen of this country. So we talk about patriotism, ordering your loves, what that looks like, political involvement, how to think about our history, good and bad, you know, all those kinds of things. And my conclusion is essentially that, you know, you don't always, most of the time, you don't have to choose between love of God and love of country. That's about ordering these things well. And if you love God well, you can love your country well. And I would also argue, I actually argue in the book, that patriotism is not only okay for a Christian, I think it's somewhat required.
Mm-hmm.
How do you seek the welfare of a city that you are ambivalent about, or that you actually
Mm-hmm.
hate or loathe? So,
Mm-hmm.
those are the motivations for writing it.
Yeah, and I don't know if I've told you this before, but we have six commitments at Truth in the Public Square, and the sixth one, or one of them, is Christian patriotism. And I was
Mm,
forward with the idea, along with my colleague Isaiah Kellerman, about potentially using the term Christian nationalism. We
mhm.
both appreciated some sentiments of there, and there's been
Yeah.
some people who would use that word that we are basically
Mhm.
fully aligned with on almost everything. But we also see that the way that that's terms used is it's very
Mhm.
a word that is a term that's not super clear, and there it has a wide array of
Yeah.
people who would use that term. So if you could just help us define what is exactly Christian patriotism, what makes it different from Christian
Mhm.
nationalism, and then why is Christian patriotism further aligned with Christian theology rather than those who especially promote like an ethno-Christian nationalism. I don't know if that question makes sense, but I think that'd be a
Yeah.
helpful thing for you to answer.
Yeah, I think a couple things. First of all, you're right in the sense that the term Christian nationalism has been so um, supercharged, and it's kind of used as a pejorative to
Mm-hmm.
describe any Christian. And it's funny, it's always conservatives, right? It's never progressive Christians that are involved in public policy or things like that.
Yeah.
But it's been used as a pejorative to describe any Christian that loves their country, is involved in political activism and action, that thinks and believes that there's some kind of Christian influence on the founding of the nation. So I think that's unfortunate. There is a group of folks that are self-described Christian nationalists. I think it's a small group, but
Mhm.
they're fairly loud, and it's an ongoing conversation among Christians. Whether it's the self-described Christian nationalists among Protestants or Catholic integralists among
Mhm.
Catholics, and the people that are self-described in this way, Christian nationalists, are somewhat dissatisfied with the constitutional arrangement, and they feel like this idea of classic liberalism, of freedom, religious liberty, has led to all this moral decay and all this kind of stuff, and
Mhm.
they favor a more explicitly Christian state, maybe even a theocratic state. You think of
Mhm.
Stephen Wolfe's project and some things like that. As Baptists, we would disagree with that. We would say that, um, you know, we don't believe, and I think the founders were wise, that you don't want to give the state the power to
Mhm.
regulate belief, to
Mhm.
regulate worship. That's not something that the state is equipped for. The founders looked through human history, particularly the church history, and saw whenever that happened, it was never good for the state or the church. And so they wanted to have freedom to worship. And we fundamentally believe that God is Lord of the conscience, right? That's
Mhm.
what it says in the Baptist Faith and Message. Um, Early Baptists believe it was a terribly wrong thing to burden someone's conscience, to make them believe a certain way or make them not believe a certain way or worship a certain way, right? The English separatists separated, right, because they didn't want to be told how to worship. So we don't want to give the state that kind of power. I'm also a limited government guy, and I'm just saying and thinking the government can barely run a healthcare website or the post office or the DMV. I don't think they're equipped to say who's believing rightly and wrongly.
Mhm.
That being said, that doesn't mean we're choosing secularism, and I think
Yes.
that's been a misinterpretation in the
Mhm.
last 50, 60, 70 years of this country, particularly by the courts and
Mhm.
some by the media and others, that advocating this kind of secularism, that you can have a neutral public square. Richard John Newhouse talked about this 40 years ago with his book, The Naked Public Square, which I highly recommend, and I quote in my book extensively. And he said, the naked public square will be naked for not that long. Someone's values will fill that.
Mhm.
We've seen that in our country. Um, the LGBT movement has filled in that space with their own sort of quasi-religious practices and high holy days and symbols and rituals and all that kind of stuff. So we're not advocating for seculars. We want to push Christianity out of the public square. We want Christians to be involved. We should bring our faith to the public square. And we acknowledge, as our documents do, that our rights come from somewhere. So they come from a creator. All the founders, even though they weren't all evangelical Christians, some were, but many weren't, they all grew up in an environment of Christianity. And they never envisioned secularism. They understood that in order for this experiment to flourish, this experiment in ordered liberty, you have to have a thick layer of virtue and religion, and I would argue Christianity. John Adams says this is only made for a moral and religious people. Even the most secular of our founders, Thomas Jefferson and Ben Franklin, really understood that this will not work without a thick layer of Christianity. So we're not arguing for secularism as Baptists, but we also don't want a Christian state. We think that power should be diverse. It should be distributed. When you give the state that kind of power over someone's conscience, it's always misused. You may think, well, I'll get a good Christian prince in this time who will share my values and he'll enforce good values. Okay, maybe that happens. I doubt that would happen. But what about the next guy? And this is what the founders talk about. So if you get the state that power, what about the next guy that has that power? And is he going to use it wisely? So I think the arrangement we have is not perfect, right? We're not in the kingdom of heaven, but it's pretty good. I think it's the best experiment in human government that's ever been tried. It's up to us to preserve it. And so I think Christian patriotism, differing from true Christian nationalism, not the pejorative that's often used, is a love of country, a love of the symbols, the places, the ideals of the country, and a desire to preserve them. I think that's what patriotism. Patriotism is not automatically saying everything your country has done is good. Sometimes patriotism demands that you oppose certain administrations or policies. Teddy Roosevelt has a great quote about this. Sometimes patriotism means you actually oppose certain things in the government, right? Patriotism calls us up to our highest ideals, and we've not fully lived up to them, but we've made a lot of progress. And so I think that's kind of what we're talking about here.
Yeah, I think the ultimate goal is that it should be every Christian who's a citizen of the United States should be committed to the welfare and the human flourishing of the United States through the pursuit of public policies that reflect the truth and justice of God's word. And even if not everyone in that country, in the United States, fully recognizes it, we believe that Christianity is reality. So anything that is real, anything that is true, is truly Christian, because we believe that that the God of the Scriptures is the God of reality. One thing that also made me think about is even beyond Baptist thought when it comes to the separation of church and state, the Baptist thought of of being against a Christian civil magistrate, is that I mean Jesus clearly. So even if you're a Presbyterian or you're another tradition, I think the Scripture is fairly clear that Christ's kingdom is not of this world. That's what there is, at least a level of discontinuity between the old covenant kingdom and the new covenant kingdom.
Absolutely.
And I think that's like one thing that I think that there's many Presbyterian brothers that agree with that. And I just think that is an important thing that we need to realize as Christians is, hey, this kingdom is not of this world. One day, United States will no longer exist, and that's a good thing, because that means Christ has returned. It's my goal, it's my desire that the United States will, obviously it depends on what's your eschatology, but I hope that the United States flourishes until Christ returns. And
absolutely.
But yeah, I think that's a really helpful framework for Christians to understand, is the separation between that only the church has, only Christ is Lord of the conscience, and the state cannot step into there.
And the church has been given the keys of the kingdom, not the state, right? I think of Paul's prayer Paul's instruction to Timothy for how to pray in 1 Timothy 2, pray for all kings and all in authority. Why? So that you may live a quiet and peaceable life. Why? And you keep going through, and he talks about so that the gospel can be advanced, because there's only one mediator between God and man, Christ Jesus. I think those verses tie together. I think what Paul is saying, the government's not the mediator between God and man. It's Christ. The government doesn't decide who's in and out of the kingdom. That's the job of Jesus. And I think if you look at, for instance, and David Van Drunen has I don't agree with everything he says. I'm not a two kingdoms guy, but I think this he's got a lot of really good stuff in this book. His book, Politics After Christendom, and he talks about God's expectations for the nations other than Israel, right? So Israel was a theocratic state. It was a theocratic state for a specific time and purpose, to be a light to the nations, and out of whom the Messiah would come. But that was a special time and place. God's expectations of the nations that were not Israel was much more modest, right? And you look at the Noahic covenant, and it's a fairly modest expectation compared to what he has for Israel. And you get into the New Testament, it's very similar. Romans 13, 1 Timothy. And so I think our Christianity gives us a little bit of realism that there's a lot of good we can do. There's a lot of our Christian principles we can bring to bear on public policy. But, as you said, there's always going to be some discontinuity. We're not home yet. And what we're waiting for is Christ to return to fully consummate his kingdom. And so I also think we have to deal with what's prudent and what's realistic. And Andrew Walker talks about this a little bit, but that's also part of stewarding our citizenship and stewarding this moment, is what is possible. And as much as you would love to have a fully Christian state, we are not going to get our fellow citizens to vote for a explicitly evangelical Christian state. It's just not happening, right? We can barely get them to vote for a pro-life referendum in a red state, right? So we have to deal with what is doable, what is prudent, what is possible. And I also think that's within kind of expectations of what God expects for us here. But there's a lot we can do. And a lot of what I want to say is to encourage Christians into the public square, to take advantage of this moment. We have been given a stewardship that few Christians in human history have been given, that few humans in human history have been given. We have a voice, we have a vote. We get to shape, in some small part, the people that rule over. We could choose the people who rule over us and the policies that affect us and our neighbors flourishing. We may wish we had more influence. We may wish things went different ways. But we have an opportunity that few people have ever had. And so I don't think we can just retreat and say, I'm not going to do this. I think it's incumbent on Christians to be involved.
No, I totally agree with you on that. And you mentioned this earlier on in the episode, is that if we don't speak in the public square, if Christians don't speak in the public square, someone else will, and will impose their worldviews and values on us and our children and grandchildren.
Yeah.
And so if Christians don't step up and are active in some way when it comes to speaking in the public square, and I think that's just, it first starts off with voting. Be sure that you're voting, that you have, I think, a stewardship. And, I don't want to bind someone's conscience and say that you must vote. But, I think that it's very prudent and wise to vote for the best candidate, and that would be most conducive to human flourishing and the benefit of our nation. Moving forward on top of that, so now we've kind of set the stage that, hey, Christians should feel the responsibility to engage in the public square. How can they faithfully engage culture and politics when it comes to their involvement in the public square?
Well, I think, as you said, every Christian should be involved in some way. And it's going to depend on your gifts and your calling and your opportunities, right? So at the very baseline, as you said, be engaged in using your right as a citizen to vote. And, not just national elections every 4 years for president, although you should, but in primaries, right? I actually think there's a lot of work Christians can do in primaries to say, who is the best candidate with the best policies, the best character, who has a chance to actually win, and in local races too, school boards and state representatives, and all those things matter, right? So using our voice and our vote in that way, but depending on your calling, God's going to call some folks to do public square work like I do and you do, like writing columns and speaking out and using our voice, and maybe even advocacy with people that we know in the government. Other people are going to have a deeper involvement. Maybe there's someone in your church that's called to run for office, for school board or for state rep or state senator or some office, mayor or something like that. And I think it's a good and noble thing for Christians to step up and do. Other people, it's going to be a little quiet. You're like, I'm going to have my business and raise my family, but I'm going to be engaged in the community, engaged in the civic communities. For others, it's going to be, I'm going to start a nonprofit to solve this issue, right? Whether it's literacy or it's homelessness or it's the pro-life issue or a pregnancy center or something like that. Whatever God calls you to do, I think God does call us to not disengage, to speak out. And as you said, if Christians don't enter these places, then something will fill it that's much worse. And often people will say, well, Christians shouldn't be part of a political party because we shouldn't, put our loyalty in any one party. And there's a certain extent that that's right. Like our loyalty to the kingdom of God supersedes our party loyalty. But I think it's okay to be part of earthly institutions. And if a particular party is the best vehicle for you and the values you hold, it's okay to be part of that. If you do hold that loosely and say, okay, there's going to be aspects of this movement and this party that I disagree with because I'm a Christian. Right? So I don't want the party catechizing me. I want to be entering in this space as a missionary to say, here's the values I'm bringing. But it's always going to be imperfect. It's always going to be uneasy. It's always going to be a little bit because, we're not home yet. We're not, the kingdom of God is not here. There's always going to be some dissonance between the kingdom of God and the earthly institutions. But it's okay to join those provided we order those rightly. And so I think it's good and noble for Christians to vote, to step up and run for office. There's a lot of young people. I'm in DC a lot, and man, I'm really amazed by how many Christian young people are working on staffs in Congress, the House, and the Senate, think tanks, in the White House, media, and it's great. And look, it's hard work. It's imperfect work. Sometimes you get 70% of what you like to see instead of 100%. You have to make, but man, I think it's good and noble work, and I want to encourage Christians to be involved and engaged in it as best they can.
No, I'm definitely with you there, and that Christians really do need to step up in the public square and to speak truth in there, in hopes that it can change the culture around them. You mentioned it a little bit, but I'd love for you to expand on how can Christians participate in politics without becoming captive to a partisan identity or being outraged and being driven by that. Into most likely in our circles, be more driven to the right side and being having too much of a identity on the right side. Although the GOP is more aligned with a Christian worldview, how can Christians have those guardrails so that in a decade in the future, we're not on the wrong side of things?
Yeah, I think, number one, I think our personal spiritual disciplines matter. Church attendance, Bible reading, good community, good Christian fellowship is key, right? That not only keeps us true and straight in terms of our theology and our, but also, Paul says to watch your life and doctrine. And I think that's really important. I think church attendance matters. I think I often argue with journalists and others, and I say, actually, you guys think Christians in politics is dangerous. And I'm saying church-going Christians are the best kind of people in politics because there's a sense of realism, that you're going to church every week, you're learning about what's transcendent, that sort of check on some of these other things. And then you can enter this arena with some healthy realism and, not get... I think what happens is if we let the politics, we need to let our faith guide our politics, not our politics guide our faith. And so when the politics guides us, and when we start to see like the politics of the moment changes what we believe, or if we put so much faith in it that we're white knuckling every election, and we forget that God is sovereign and God is in control, having done everything we can do, you're going to have losses. You're going to lose elections. You're going to lose legislative battles. But understand the Lord is in control. I think that's really, really important. I think it's okay to be identified with a particular side, as long as your main identity is as a Christian, right? And C.S. Lewis talks about this in his book Ordering the Four Loves, and he's really borrowing from Augustine, who I think is borrowing from Jesus. But we have our allegiance to Christ, but we can have these lesser allegiances, right? And so it's not always pitting one against the other. If we love God well, we'll have to do these lesser allegiances as well. I have people that say, well, I could never pledge allegiance to the flag because I only pledge allegiance to Christ. I'm like, well, we know how to do lesser allegiances. 23 years ago, I pledged a vow to my wife, and the pastor didn't say, you can only pledge allegiance to your wife or to God, but not both. No,
Hmm.
he said, if you put God first, that'll rightly order, and you'll be a good husband to your wife, because it sits underneath that, right? And I think it can be like that even with parties, right? Like, you first love God, and then you love your family and in the church, and then you love your country, and then or probably say, okay, I'm an American, I'm a conservative because of these biblical values. That probably puts me on the right, and that probably means the electoral vehicle to get people elected is probably going to be Republican, right?
Hmm.
Now, maybe one day it'll change and there'll be a competition for those voters, but that's kind of where it is. And if you order those well, now what happens is if the party becomes more important than, you give up your conservative values for the party, or becomes more important than your faith, then you have a problem. And I think some people can get too engaged, and to where if you start to see that Christianity becomes a obstacle to your politics, then you might have things out of order. Think of
Hmm.
Jonah, right? Jonah loved his country. Jonah was a patriot. God tells Jonah, I want you to go to Nineveh to reach the people of Nineveh with the message that God saves. Well, the Assyrians were their worst enemy. They were their sworn enemies. They couldn't stand, um, you know, they were people to be afraid of. They were bloodthirsty, wicked people. And Jonah's response was not, he even says it in Jonah, that it's not that I don't think you can save them, it's that I don't want you to save them, right? And I think it's good to love our country. It's good to be patriotic. If that becomes so much of a priority that we stop loving the nations, we think missionary endeavors are kind of weak. We think evangelism is not great because we hate those people. Then we've got it out of order. Then we've
Hmm.
let our politics shape our faith. So I think we have to guard that. And I think the spiritual disciplines, Christian community really is important for that.
No, that's helpful, and to think long term, if by God's grace, if that there could be a turning point in America where it seems a little bit with my generation. I'm a Gen Zer,
Mm-hmm.
where there's some people that contest it of some sort of. I use the term revival lightly because I do want to
Mm-hmm.
reserve that to a true work of the Spirit that we saw, primarily in the first Great Awakenings. But if that is true, that this next generation, Lord willing, the following generations will become a little more back to reality over the past 50 years with just cultural Marxism,
Mm-hmm.
just like postmodernity, just seeping through our educational
Yeah.
systems. And I think that, I have a bunch of friends who, when I came to faith into high school, and they weren't Christians yet, once they got to college, that kind of led them to Christ, was that they saw this worldview being
Yeah.
disconjointed, and because we are rational beings, they
Yeah.
couldn't they were like, this is not true, this is not reality, and that ultimately kind of led them in some ways to the Lord. I think that what the mindset we should have as Christians is, engage faithfully, uh, you know, continually long for heaven, long for Christ, and by God's grace, if our nation can be, restored back
Mm-hmm.
to where it's, primarily like majority of our citizens are Christians, and we're able to have all our protected rights and liberties, then that should drive us for our churches to continually send out missionaries to
Yeah.
bring the gospel to the nations, and that they may come to Christ. And so, thank you so much, Dan, for joining me. I know you have to go in a few minutes. Is there any kind of closing remarks that you have that you'd like to part with?
Yeah, sure. First, I want to encourage you to get my book, In Defense of Christian Patriotism. Um, I want to just close with something that you said, because I want to just reinforce that. I am actually very bullish on your generation and on Gen Z. I think God is up to something. I think a lot of young people in your generation are passionate for the Lord. There's this stirrings happening on college campuses. Um, I think, and not just, it's interesting. There's a turn toward the Lord, which is so wonderful. And as you said, I think there's also a sense in the country that, maybe some of this left wing stuff went too far, and I think some people call them reality respecters. People are, I attribute that to natural law, that God has woven, you know, he has revealed himself through creation. He's woven into the universe the way that is good for human flourishing. He's wired that into the human universe. And even though folks, suppress that, as it says in Romans, we can appeal to that. And I think it's been successful that people have said, wait a minute, this transgender thing has gone way too far. Like, this doesn't make any sense. Or this super woke stuff doesn't make any sense. And they've pulled back on that, which is why I'm never truly pessimistic about the American experiment. I mean, progressives have this idea that we're always just going to keep progressing on, right? The Hegelian thesis, and some conservatives have that in reverse, that everything's slouching toward Gomorrah. And I just think these things go in cycles. Yep. And, I think of the 60s and 70s in this country, where you think of all the tumult and turmoil. You had Vietnam, you had the sexual revolution, you had race riots, you had 3 assassinations, you had Watergate. I mean, it was just a really difficult time, right? And underneath this, what nobody saw coming was this Jesus movement, where young people were like, none of this is working. Where's the truth? And they came to Christ in such a powerful way. And then you had, I would argue, a conservative resurgence with Ronald Reagan coming into power and talking about morning in America again, and talking about the goodness of our nation's ideals. And I think those things are possible, right? We have to be people of hope. We have to be people that root for renewal and be the ones that are part of that. That comes through spiritual revival. I mean, if we truly want our nation to be renewed and restored, it's going to come through spiritual renewal and revival. You think of the Second Great Awakening and all the impact of that. You think of post-World War II with Billy Graham. I mean, we should pray for a fresh wind of God's Spirit to renew our churches, and for evangelism, discipleship, and for people to be wise and come to their senses and to understand that God has ordered the world to work in a certain way, right? When it comes to marriage and family and all these kinds of things. And so I think we're seeing some of that. I'm really excited about your generation. And I think God has some great things in store for Gen Z. I'm a little biased because I teach Gen Z kids, and I have 4 of them in my house, and I'm really proud of them. So yeah, be encouraged, man. There's some really good stuff around the horizon, I think.
Well, thank you, Dan. I definitely concur with you there that the Lord looks like he might be doing something with the next generation, and just praying that it is a true work of the Spirit, and then it continues pressing on from every church and throughout our nation, and then ultimately to every nation around the globe. And so thank you, Dan, for joining me. And yeah, if you don't have the book already, highly recommend getting this book right here.